and welcome to a special edition of Liberty Nation's Swamponomics videocast. I'm Andrew Moran, Allen's economics correspondent. This week, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's 50-year budget deficit. Despite championing sunny ways and claiming that the federal budget would balance itself, storm clouds have gathered over Canada's fiscal picture. Trudeau failed to balance a budget by 2019. The deficit ballooned. The national debt topped $1 trillion. A new CD Howe Institute report also projects that the debt-to-GDP ratio could surge to 140% by 2055. And that is just the tip of the iceberg in the Great White North. A new fiscal sustainability report projects the federal government will not balance a budget until 2070. To help us understand what the fiscal mess north of the border is and what this means for Canadians, please welcome our guest, Mr. Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Welcome, sir.
Well, hey, thanks so much for having me on today.
Pleasure. So 50 years is certainly a long time to see a budget return to balance. So how much debt could Canada accumulate during this period, and how will interest payments play a role in this debt accumulation?
Well, it's absolutely mind-boggling, isn't it, that under the status quo, us Canadians, we might not see a balanced federal budget for another about 50 years, right? Not until 2070. And just to put that into perspective for Canadians, that would almost be like our former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau with his governments in the early 70s, setting us on a path where we wouldn't see a balanced budget until today. So that's absolutely mind-boggling. But just as mind-boggling is the debt accumulation that would happen under that status quo. So if we don't end up balancing a budget until 2070 federally, that would add about $2.7 trillion in additional debt, which is on top of the already $1 trillion in federal government debt that you manage. And I think even more concerning is the interest charges, right? The annual cost to service the government debt. By 2070, that would cost Canadian taxpayers about $3.8 trillion. So that's trillions of dollars that can't go to healthcare. That's trillions of dollars that can't go to fixing potholes on the road. And that's trillions of dollars that can't go back into our pockets through lower taxes, because that money would have to go to the bond fund managers to service the government debt.
Now, are these conservative estimates? In other words, is it likely that Canada's finances are going to be a lot worse off than what is being discussed? Or could those sunny ways finally come to fruition and the budget transitions into a surplus well before the year 2070?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think first we have to remember that these are just projections, right? These are projections over decades. So we have to remember that there isn't anything actually stopping politicians from balancing the budget well before 2070. What it is a huge red flag for Canadian taxpayers to be taking this seriously. And not only do we have to actually balance the budget, which under the status quo won't happen until 2070, but we also have to pay down the debt after we balance the budget. And the parliamentary budget officer who produced these numbers said that under the status quo, after we balance the budget, it would still take at least 2 decades to pay down all of the federal government debt. So all of this is very alarming, but here's really the scary part. The PBO assumes that effective interest rates will settle in around 2.84%. But that's still low relative to historical rates, right? So between 1991 and 2014, interest rates were higher than 2.84%. So what happens if interest rates spike? I think that's very concerning. Also, the PBO data assumes that Canada is going to have this steady upward climb in terms of economic growth. Well, what happens if Canada stumbles into another downturn? Also, the PBO has to assume that politicians are actually going to use some surplus money to pay down the debt. Again, what if these rosy projections don't actually bear out in reality? And I think that bears the question. I mean, are today's Canadians ever going to see a debt-free Canada?
The PBO report also noted that, quote, changes in revenues and program spending is required to stabilize the government's net debt to GDP ratio over the long term. So how would a 50-year deficit impact future generations of taxpayers, and what actions do you think would be necessary during this time to return to balance?
Well, that's just such a super important consideration. And it really brings up the issue of intergenerational fairness, or really unfairness, right? Because all of this spending today is going to these special interest groups of today, but who's going to have to pay this tab, right? The trillions of dollars in debt, trillions of dollars of interest charges. Well, it's going to be future generations. Now, I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, politicians like to buy votes with our money. Well, in Canada right now, politicians are buying votes with Canadians' grandkids and Canadians' great-grandkids' money. Now, in terms of what needs to happen, we need to see these federal politicians start to rein in their deficit spending. And the spending problem in Ottawa happened much before COVID-19 touched down, right? If you look at 2018, 2019, we had our federal government spending all-time highs, even when considering inflation and population growth. Now let that sink in for a second. That means our federal government was spending more than in any single year during World War II, then the Korean War, or any of the other recessions, right? So it's absolutely mind-boggling. And I won't go into too much of the nuts and bolts, but here are a few things that we need to see happen in Canada. We need to see all this crazy, costly, I should say, COVID-19 spending remain temporary. That is a must. We need to see our government employees being willing to share in the tough times. The federal government has no records of its employees ever receiving a pay cut. And I think the third thing that we have to see is we need to see politicians say no to corporate welfare, right? The last thing that we need are politicians and bureaucrats running around trying to play investment banker with our tax dollars. And I'll just add one more thing. We need to see our politicians as well as our bureaucrats being willing to share in the tough times. I think what's been such a slap in the face for so many taxpayers is that during COVID-19, our members of parliament have pocketed not one, but two pay raises. Crazy.
Problems in Ottawa are well documented. So are any of the provinces doing better or in better financial shape than the federal government?
Yeah, well, the provinces aren't a bunch of beauty pageant contestants either. I mean, they're in bad shape as well. Case in point, Newfoundland and Labrador, right? We just heard a $5.2 billion federal bailout for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. So obviously the first thing that strikes us there is, well, that's a huge cost for Canadian taxpayers, but I think there's other important considerations. I mean, number one, the federal government is now putting Canadian taxpayers on the hook for bad decisions being made by big spending politicians in Newfoundland and Labrador. And what I mean by that is you look at Newfoundland and Labrador spending, well, their per person spending is the most among any Canadian province. And if they brought their spending in line with Canadian provinces, their own taxpayers would save about $1 billion every single year. And I think even more crucial is what type of precedent does this set, right? It essentially says to all these big spending provincial politicians, hey, don't worry about your own budgets because the federal government, i.e. Canadian taxpayers, will come in to bail you out. So that is something we are very concerned with because this bailout to Newfoundland and Labrador is costing Canadian taxpayers billions of dollars. But if these federal politicians start trying to bail out the bigger provinces like Ontario, for example, that could cost us tens of billions of dollars or even more than that.
And finally, with rampant speculation that the Prime Minister will call an early federal election this fall, are any of the other parties taking this matter seriously? Are the Conservatives, New Democrats, or Greens taking the public purse and making the central focal point of their campaign? Or has it become expected that Ottawa will just run a budget imbalance for many years to come because of the pandemic?
Well, we're definitely not seeing politicians take these deficits as serious as they should be. I mean, the Conservative Party, they said that they would try to balance the budget within a decade, but a plan to do something in 10 years isn't really a great plan, especially when you think of all the extra debt, all the extra interest charges that would pile on. And, I think why this is so important for Canadians right now is we are hearing the Trudeau government make all of these spending announcements. So I think all Canadians need to ask a very simple but serious question to these politicians is, well, how are you going to pay for all of this? All of the spending announcements, right? Because when you add up provincial and federal government debt, each Canadian owes about $57,000 in government debt by the end of the year. And that bill is only going to go up if these politicians keep on with the new spending announcements.
So 50 years is a long time. One of Trudeau's children could perhaps become prime minister by then. The Conservative Party might see a dozen or so new leaders. The NDP may once again get so close to forming the government, but then fall short of receiving a mandate. That said, the 21st century has mostly been swamped in red ink, with Ottawa running a federal deficit for 13 years since 2000. As history has shown throughout the world, it is an unsustainable path when nations are perpetually hemorrhaging red ink. So that's it for me this week. I'd like to thank our guest, Mr. Terrazzano, for appearing on Liberty Nation Swamponomics videocast, and you can read my full column on libertynation.com. Thank you.
Who are we? We are Americans that believe in liberty. We are a project of the nonprofit One Generation Away. We are patriots who apply the founding principles to the issues of today.
And they keep moving the goalposts on us.
We are educators and commentators who love America and the Constitution. Who are we? We are Liberty Nation.